Welcome back to the 411 on Wrestling Podcast. I'm your host, Blake Lovell, back here with thoughts on the current happenings in wrestling, and there are quite a few of them right now as we are officially on the road to WrestleMania in WWE, and that includes the fallout from Elimination Chamber and more Cody Rhodes talk, because still, I think a lot of people waiting for him to pop up in WWE. Will it happen? When will it happen? We'll discuss that a bit as well. But let's talk first about the fallout from Elimination Chamber, which took place, of course, last weekend in Saudi Arabia, which I don't think involved many surprises at all when you look back at what took place and really the direction now that things start to head in towards WrestleMania. I think when you combine the two together, a lot of things that they did at Elimination Chamber makes complete sense, and we've started to see that play out here moving forward. Going back to it, we're not going to go through this match by match. You guys by now already know what happened, but let's talk about the biggest sort of takeaways and really what happened at Elimination Chamber and the ones that have the most consequences here moving forward. The biggest one, as we all know, is Brock Lesnar winning the WWE Championship inside the Elimination Chamber. Did it without beating the former champion, Bobby Lashley, who at this point seems to, and perhaps by the time you're listening to this, I know Bobby Lashley visited with Dr. James Andrews, which if you've watched wrestling for a long time, you know that's a name you don't want to hear, because that means that someone likely has a pretty serious injury. And of course, the reports came out that Lashley could be dealing with a shoulder issue that could require surgery. Certainly that would keep him out of WrestleMania. So Lesnar wins the championship without Lashley being involved at all, based on them taking him out of the chamber the way they did with the spot, breaking through the chamber and all of that. So Lashley's out of the picture, and it was clear once that happened. I think anyone that was expecting anyone other than Brock Lesnar was probably not necessarily paying attention to what had been going on, because everything has sort of been built towards the direction of Brock Lesnar versus Roman Reigns, title for title. We knew we were going to get Lesnar versus Reigns at WrestleMania. We've known this for a couple months now, but it was just a matter of time once you realized they were going to go this direction. And really, once they announced that Lesnar was going to be inside the chamber, you knew that that was likely the direction they're going in, because they're not going to have him lose. Otherwise, why even put him in the match? And so, I mean, how he won the match, that is, I'm sure we'll have plenty of discussion on that in terms of, Brock comes in and basically destroys everyone. Austin Theory gets the spot at the end where he just happens to be the last person left, but Brock pretty much takes care of business, and they did it in dominant fashion. I mean, it's, if you're a Seth Rollins, AJ Styles, Riddle fan, may not have been the most exciting way to see them eliminated, but this is all about Brock, and they've made that clear for a long time now, that this is about getting the Brock and Roman, and if you want to have the biggest match possible to sell the most tickets, Brock and Roman is one thing. As we've talked about before, it's a rematch, so you have to do it a different way this time, and it's flipped where Roman's the heel, Brock's the babyface. But if you're going to sell it and want to sell more tickets, you certainly want to raise the stakes, and they've done that here, title for title, and we'll see what comes of it. But I'm not surprised at all. As I think we had, we talked about and everything we kind of had on the side. It was pretty obvious that once Brock was inserted into the match, he was going to win. And now this is the direction they've chosen. And with Lashley out, perhaps, for WrestleMania, in hindsight, maybe that was the one they felt was the best to go with. And otherwise, does that change anything? Is Lashley the WWE champion and they just simply go with Brock versus Roman? Who knows? But this is the route they're going, and as for everyone else involved in the chamber match, it'll be interesting to see what's next for them. We'll talk about one particular direction, perhaps, here in just a minute. But it was all about Brock, and that was just the route they chose to go in. And I can understand people wondering if that was the best route long term, but short term, they want to build up everything for WrestleMania, and that's exactly what they did by having Brock pretty much destroy everyone and look like an absolute monster. Brock is impressive. I mean, I understand sort of the issues everyone has with just WWE always turning back to Brock. I mean, Brock is Vince's guy. They will turn back to him in these kind of times. But Brock still, in this particular iteration, I think is very impressive. I mean, he's just Brock is unlike anyone else we've seen in WWE history, probably just in terms of all the different tools he has and all of that. But when Brock wants to be great, he can still be pretty great. And I thought at least just the way he ran through everyone, if you're looking at it just from the character standpoint and from WWE's standpoint, not to say that you think it's the right move or the wrong move, but if you just look at it from how they presented it, how are you not impressed with Brock Lesnar and the way he can kind of captivate an audience just with his his power and strength and everything he does and the realness of what he can do in the ring, but also I think just in this character itself, playing more of a loose type character that is more likable, I think, than certainly characters in the past he's played that were not meant to be likable. So that's where things stand with Brock, and we'll talk more about that match as we get closer to it. Brock versus Roman will be the headliner for WrestleMania 38. Elsewhere on the elimination card, I mean, Roman Reigns defeating Goldberg, no surprise there. I don't think anyone had any thought that this was going to be a title change. Goldberg was just back for, let's face it, he was back for a huge payday in this one, and it was Saudi Arabia, and we know that they have stacked these cards over the years, and this was just kind of your place to put this match, knowing that you probably were not going to revisit it again, and if you wanted to do it, this was the time to do it, and that was exactly what it should have been. Short match, Reigns wins, nothing more to it than that. The Women's Elimination Chamber, another one that felt pretty predictable going in, and that was Bianca Belair coming out victorious over Rhea Ripley, Liv Morgan, Doudrop, Nikki ASH, and Alexa Bliss. I think, we all anticipated the eventual rematch with Bianca and Becky. I don't know, everyone who's listened to this podcast regularly knows my thoughts on how everything went down with Becky and Bianca at SummerSlam last year. I thought it was just a bad idea from the start, and I think the follow-up was not much better. It didn't do anything for either one of them. And now they have a chance to correct that by, I think, making this what it needs to be at WrestleMania, and you know exactly what I'm saying. I mean, this is one where Bianca, I think, has to win this match. If this is going to be any sort of scenario where that was worth anything, to do the 26-second squash or whatever it was in SummerSlam, if it's going to mean anything, Bianca winning Elimination Chamber, beating Becky at WrestleMania, that's the traditional path you would take here, unless they decide to go, swerve you or do a different direction. But I think that's where we're headed with all this, and that's why it was pretty obvious where they were going to go here, because Liv had her shot, Doudrop's had her shot. It wasn't going to be Nikki ASH. You could have made a case perhaps for Rhea Ripley versus Becky Lynch, or if they really wanted to go, another direction with this Alexa Bliss character, that would have been it. But storyline-wise, the only choice was Bianca Belair. So they got that right here. I thought that, this was a match that was really all about Bianca and showcasing her talents. Rhea Ripley was impressive while she was in there. Alexa's character, still a lot to be seen moving forward, I think, where they're going to go with this. But, they clearly want to put her in a position to succeed. And we'll talk about the WrestleMania card in a second, but where things go from her, I think is at least interesting to kind of figure out, to see what they do with her. But, that was another very predictable finish, I think, inside the Elimination Chamber. Elsewhere, not a lot of notes. Worth noting here, I think the Rousey-Charlotte interaction in the tag match was something. I thought Naomi was impressive in the tag match with her teaming with Rousey against Flair and Sonya. The match was what it was. You knew, again, this was another one. You knew the finish of this match was going to be Rousey defeating DeVille in some way, shape, or form. That's what happened here. And that was that. You knew Drew McIntyre was going to defeat Madcap Moss. Really good match, though. I think, Madcap Moss is kind of someone that's grown on me a bit. I know the one spot we're going to be talking about coming out of this match is just the fact that this guy could even move after basically just planting himself right on his head on the ring. That was a very scary spot. But as far as we know, based on reports, he's okay. But I think Madcap Moss is one of those guys that the character, the name, he's gonna have an issue getting over, I think, with that. But you can see the potential with this guy. Even someone like Paul Heyman, who is, in the interview rounds he's done before, has talked about how Madcap Moss he thinks is just a future main eventer without question. So it's just he's got to get away from this character to be able to do that. He's not going to be a WrestleMania main eventer as Madcap Moss. I think we all understand that. But we'll talk about Drew in a minute. I'm a little concerned for Drew here based in this feud, but we'll talk about it here shortly. Becky and Lita I thought was better than maybe expected. I'm not saying it was perfect, but it exceeded my expectations because I just, you don't know what you're going to get from Lita. I mean, she's been away from the ring for a while. Yes, she's come back for the Rumble matches, but you never know, right? Like, this is someone who still has not regularly been a wrestler in a long time, and yet I thought the crowd was really into it. I mean, you even seen WWE, I don't know if that was impromptu or I think they would have had to just go with it on the fly and say, hey, look how much the crowd has responded to Lita here, and they're doing all this clapping and celebrating, even though she loses, and so they give her kind of that moment in the ring after the match. So my guess is, and of course I don't know this, but my guess is they will find something for Lita to do in the future, and maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe they find something at WrestleMania. I'm not sure, but I think you can at least see that Lita is someone that she can still go in some of these matches. Again, I'm not saying it was perfect, and this is not going to be a 5-star classic in anyone's mind, but it was much better than I thought it would be. Just based on not knowing what to expect from a fresh matchup like this, where these two have not really had a match before, and you've got someone who's been retired. It's just you never know what you're going to get out of that. But I thought it was good, and I think now it's do they use Lita more? I mean, again, if there are spots you can find her, good for her. But do they do it based on not wanting her to perhaps entertain another offer from AEW or something like that? That's what I find most intriguing in this scenario. So we will see on that. But everything else, like I said, I mean, this was a pay-per-view that went, a premium live event. We're not doing pay-per-views anymore here, folks. It went about as expected. So not a lot to take away from it. I thought it was, as usual, a solid show. I don't think it was a great show. It was a predictable show, but it was one that at least points you in the direction of where you want to go for WrestleMania. And that's now a good way to transition into looking at WrestleMania 38. Still a long way to go before we get there, but the card starting to take shape, and it does it takes shape coming out of Elimination Chamber. And as of right now, as things stand, we have officially announced that it is Roman Reigns versus Brock Lesnar, champion versus champion here. And so that's obviously the headliner. Certainly that's going to be night 2, the main event of night 2. Main event of night 1 at this point seems to probably be Charlotte Flair versus Ronda Rousey. I suppose there's a chance you could turn that around if you have one of these spectacle matches like a Steve Austin return or something like that. But I think it's, as of now, as of what we know, it's Charlotte versus Ronda is probably going to be the main event of night 1. You've also got Becky versus Bianca for the Raw Women's Championship. Those are your 3 title matches announced now. And the tag team match, Dominic and Rey Mysterio against The Miz and Logan Paul. That is another one of your, I think, just sort of, let's get a celebrity, let's get some attention mainstream-wise. Biggest show of the year, so they bring back Logan Paul. He had teased, The Miz had teased a partner, and the reports came out it's going to be Logan Paul. Sure enough, we find out on Raw that is who it's going to be. So I don't, that match is going to be what it is. I think Logan Paul topping what Bad Bunny did last year going to be very difficult. I don't think that's going to happen. But Bad Bunny has put himself kind of in a standalone spot now in terms of matches for celebrities. And then we also found out on Raw that WrestleMania will also feature an open challenge from Edge, and I assume we'll know who that's going to be beforehand, but there's a couple different scenarios here. We will know beforehand, I think, if it's not Cody Rhodes, and that's where we bring in Cody Rhodes into the conversation, because clearly, and we talked about this on last week's podcast, Cody's headed to WWE. Just a matter of when he gets there at this point. And I think you don't bring him in now if he's not going to have a big match at WrestleMania. And sure, it could be maybe Cody's the one they ultimately go with. Maybe they throw a couple red herrings here because they've really kind of pushed that it's going to be AJ Styles versus Edge. I think that's still where they go. I just feel like it makes too much sense not to do this match. These two guys have been pushing for this match now recently and longer than that, as we know. I think that's the direction they'll go here. Edge versus AJ, that gives you another really good match on the card. And then I think you can do Cody versus, to me, someone who has nothing to do right now, and that is Seth Rollins. I mean, I think, with the Owens stuff, you feel like Owens is probably going to break off if this rumor is true, and you're going to have Steve Austin make his return and wrestle. I say that, in quotes because I don't think we should be anticipating a 10-minute Kevin Owens, Steve Austin match. But if that is your anticipation, you've still got to have something for Rollins to do, and I think that's where perhaps you could bring Cody back, you can slide him in there, perhaps go Cody versus Rollins. But there's a lot of different options, I suppose, at this point. But that is where I think the Edge Open Challenge, that's going to determine a lot for several different people, right? And we're also factoring in if Bobby Lashley is out, which I think at this point it seems to be the case, that Lashley will not be wrestling at WrestleMania. That's where you have guys like that. You've got Edge, you've got Styles, you've got Owens, you've got Rollins. Those four guys have to have something to do, and I think we're starting to understand the picture of what that's going to look like with Owens and Austin maybe. Just even saying that out of my mouth right now is just insane. I'm like, really? Like Steve Austin's going to wrestle? Yes, it sounds like he may actually do that. I think there would have been a lot of denials at this point if this wasn't going to happen. I don't think you float this out there and just let it go this long without understanding that there's a real possibility this is going to take place. And so then it comes down to, I think the easy way to pair it after that is Edge Styles. And then if you're going to bring in Cody, I don't know what the story is if you do Cody and Rollins. Maybe there's something I'm just not remembering from maybe the last time these two interacted in WWE, but gosh, that feels like forever ago. But I think that's probably the way to do it because you also understand, your main eventers on Raw too. You've still got Orton and Riddle. Maybe they decide to go that route with a match with those two because this has been, as we know, a long time in the making based on those two together. So maybe there's something there, but it's on paper right now. If we're adding in the Cody Rhodes aspect, if you assume you're going to get some of these other matches, I think that this is actually a pretty good card on paper, and it has to be, right? Because remember, they are trying to sell tickets, and they have to do this for these two nights. This is a huge stadium. AT&T Stadium is massive, and you're trying to sell 200,000 tickets basically. It's very difficult to do that unless you have a card that I think is stacked the way that it is here. And I assume also, I think you're going to get Sami Zayn versus Johnny Knoxville. I know that's wrestling-wise probably not as appealing as some of the other matches, but WrestleMania is the attraction event. And, it's clear. Like, these are scenarios where you're building up attraction matches. And that's, for the most part, a lot of these are attraction matches. And a lot of them I think should be able to deliver. So it's just a matter of kind of what your preference is on some of this stuff. But, I think it's going to be interesting to see how the card continues to kind of round out and if these matches we think are going to happen. Again, certainly Austin. The more I think about it, I think if Austin does, if Austin's on the card, I think you have to put that in one of the main event spots, right? That's such a huge, massive moment. And I'm not saying that in terms of the quality of the match, but it's a spectacle. It's the attraction. I think I say that and I'm like, I still think they're probably going to lean towards we know Reigns and Lesnar's going to be the main event of night 2. There's no question about that. I'd be shocked, right? If there's any other scenario, that's going to happen. Night 1, I think, is maybe more up in the air based on Austin's return. But I see, and we've talked about this before too. I think we talked about this maybe in the last podcast. If they put Flair and Rousey in the main event, to me, this is one of those main events that the fans could turn on, knowing the type of fans that are going to be at WrestleMania. I worry about that a little bit because I worry that maybe fans turn on this match, and I don't know if you want that in your main event spot. That's where you put Austin in that spot against Owens, even if it's not a perfect match. It is unlike anything else on this card, and that includes Reigns and Lesnar. It is the most unique thing you could do at WrestleMania 38 is to have a Steve Austin wrestling match to where, now if it's going to be a 30-second ring the bell, Austin stuns Owens, and that's that I think is a little bit different. But still, that I think is the biggest question at this point. It's not of maybe, some of this other stuff that we think is going to kind of round out the card, but it's what do they do if Austin does come back and have a match? Do they slot that in one of the main event spots? I think it's hard to keep it out of there, but I also understand why you would want to have Flair and Rousey there, just based on the initial perhaps booking behind everything. But we'll see. Again, I think the card's filling out pretty well. The rest of the stuff, my guess is, will probably be made up of a lot of multi-person things. I think that's kind of what you expect at this point, to try to get a lot of people on the card. Whether it's, the Andre the Giant Battle Royal, whether you have some multi-tag matches, women's matches. However, I think that's kind of what will happen with the rest of the card. But it is one that, at least on paper, I will give WWE credit. I know, we've talked about it before, and the weekly TV can be a grind sometimes, but at the same time, they're big cards, and this is their biggest card of the year, and maybe their biggest card to date, if you think about it. I mean, The Undertaker's going to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. This is one of the biggest WrestleManias. I mean, they've done, when you certainly think about it to this point. With everything that's involved, and again, assuming the possibility of a Steve Austin return match, The Undertaker's your Hall of Fame headliner. You've got Reigns versus Lesnar, title for title, a lot of stakes there. There's a lot here, and you've got Cody's return added in. At this point, you just assume Cody's going to wrestle at WrestleMania. I guess the rumor was he was in Orlando recently, which that was one of the reports we talked about. Could be at the Performance Center already ready to go. So, there's a lot of intrigue around WrestleMania, and I think it's easy to knock WWE for a lot of things they do sometimes, and especially when it comes to consistency, but I am at least intrigued and even somewhat excited about this card, because I think there's a lot of things they can do with this. Could you also have a Bayley return, an Asuka return? If you've got Sasha out there, what can Sasha do? Like, there's still a lot of stars that we haven't even factored into some of these matches yet. So I think it's a fun card to this point. It's a fun card, I guess, overall, not just necessarily what's been announced, but when you look ahead and you start to look at the possibilities, I think it's an interesting card, and I think it's one that, ultimately there will be a lot of huge ramifications from this WrestleMania and coming out of it. So we'll see what happens with that. But now let's talk a little bit more about Cody, because, as I said, I think the expectation at this point is that Cody is going to make his return to WWE. It's just a matter of when that's going to happen now, and I think that, it's going to happen. Like, I think there are people that are still questioning, like, is this actually going to happen? Yes, like, it's going to happen. Cody is going to wind up wrestling for WWE at some point in the near future, and it's just a matter of what they decide to do with him. But, a lot more stuff has come out on Cody in terms of kind of what led to the decision, and, we did talk about this last week on the podcast, and thinking, was this a money play? Was this more of a power play? What was really the main driving force of this split between Cody and AEW? And, there has been so much out there. And you want to talk about a story that you can find a report on with ease. If you go to our website, 41mania.com, and you type in Cody Rhodes in the search results, you can see all the different reports. We have kind of put up on the sites from different places and outlets just about how this whole thing unfolded. And it is very fascinating. I mean, this is one of the biggest stories we've had in wrestling in a while, as we talked about last week, because of the uniqueness of it, of having one of the original, AEW EVPs all of a sudden jump back to WWE. And there's just so many layers to this. And Tony Khan's commented on it at this point. Tony Khan, talked about how basically, hey, he didn't really want it to get to this point, because that's never your expectation when you're going basically into business with someone like that, even though Cody's not someone that had stock in AEW or anything like this. But like, these are people that initially agreed to put this company together to basically go up against, provide an alternative to WWE. And now one of those people that was highly involved in that process is going back to WWE again, reportedly, but it's going to happen. And so I think that it's, one of those things where I get it, from Tony Khan's perspective, and we talked about it. It's just, I think there had to be so many different things that went into this. And here's what Tony Khan said. He said this on Busted Open Radio. He said that, quote, "I put out a statement that was from the heart and really positive, and I meant it. I wish them both really well, and I appreciate everything they did here in their different roles in the company. It's very sad. It's not something any of us wanted to happen. I believe that Cody has something else in the works, which we know what that means. I'm not sure about that, but we'll see. I'm sure they're going to have great opportunities in wrestling and life. You never know what's going to happen in the future. I wish them the best and very appreciative for everything they did here. So that's Tony Khan's comment, and that's what you would expect. I mean, whether there was any bad blood backstage, I think we all want to believe that sometimes. No matter what the situation, we want to believe that there was just some, this Hollywood-esque, just sort of Game of Thrones style machinations going on, right? Like we want to believe that sometimes, and I don't know if we'll ever know the answer, because I think there's always two sides to the story, right? And I think that you will be presented one thing, and maybe the truth will somewhere always lie in the middle when it comes to things like this. And so I think this is kind of the most interesting part to me, is when you look at that. Kenny Omega's also sort of commented on it, and I know Omega sort of talked about the vision, and based on the alignment of the vision and those kind of things. Did Cody have that same alignment with what AEW had become? Basically, I guess that's probably the best way to put it. Because remember, I mean, AEW has changed, and I think that's something we have to keep in mind as well. Is this a company that's changed from where it was? Because now you have brought in CM Punk, Bryan Danielson, these other people we've talked about. It is a company that has changed based on where it started and where it is now, and I think that could be a good thing, and maybe some people see it as a bad thing. But I mean, you're not going to say no to stars like Punk and Danielson and those guys, because they are going to raise your profile. It's just, what else can you do to keep raising that profile? And Kenny Omega had the interview with Wrestling Observer with Dave Meltzer and company, and he kind of talked about one of the things about one of the comments I thought was interesting was Omega said, quote, "I'm guessing that knowing Cody as well as I know him, I don't really think it was an issue of money. I don't think it was Tony not showing him enough cash to keep him invested in the company. Cody, he really believed in the vision, in the original vision that he brought to the table for AEW, and maybe in the end, we had the Bucks in their vision, we had my vision, and then we had Cody's vision, and all of our visions were different from one another." So, I mean, and then Kenny goes on to say, "And I would say mine was more similar to what the Bucks had envisioned, and Cody's was out there. It was much different." So you can kind of see there, and I don't think, if you listen to the interview, Omega's not saying this in a malicious way. He's just kind of basically pondering this whole situation. I think he's probably thinking out loud too, and wondering, how did this thing play out? And I think, something else he went on to say was, quote, "And it's very possible that this current version of AEW just wasn't a good fit for Cody. And he says, for me, I feel like he was one of the original four, and there's always going to be a place for him. And so I think it's one of those things where a company that sort of changes direction becomes something different. And again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it is different now than perhaps what it was. And something also people pointed out, when you look at we've talked about this, AEW's roster is absolutely loaded with talent, and it's loaded from a numbers standpoint. There's a lot of people on this card, and there are people that sometimes you see on the card for a couple weeks and then you don't see them again for a month or two. Because there's just so many people that have to be filtered in and out, and I'm sure it's a challenge for Tony Khan. And with Cody, he was a regular. You saw him a lot, but there are also times now where, because they have so many different storylines and so many different programs you're trying to integrate into this television program. Because remember, yes, like the YouTube stuff, we have to remember that's a smaller audience than what you're getting necessarily. Yes, views and those kind of things. You can go back and say, well, AEW Dark and Dark Elevation got hundreds of thousands of views, but it's a different sort of thing. You're not broadcasting this on national television the way you are, your 2 hours of Dynamite and your 1 hour of Rampage. So your main stories are going to be in those 3 hours of weekly TV that you have. And that's where it becomes tough to get everyone in there. And I think, eventually with Cody, it's like, well, if I'm not going to be working with Punk, if I'm not going to be working with Danielson, if I'm not going to be with Hangman, and we don't know, maybe these were scenarios we're going to have eventually, but are those spots going to be there? Because it's clear what the top programs are right now. Yes, you still had kind of the thread that continued to weave and weave and weave with Cody's character, and you never really knew which direction it was going to go in, and how much input, of that, how much of that was Cody, how much was that of Tony Khan. I think those are the kind of things that I find fascinating in terms of how it led to this point. But as I said in the last podcast, I think there is just a possibility where maybe money was a factor. Maybe he didn't get the deal he wanted, but I also think there is a scenario where Cody possibly just looks up and says, man, like I have just, I feel like maybe I should be in a bigger spot than I am right now, or something should be different about where the company is or the vision for the company, just like we just talked about with Omega and what his comments. A lot of things could play out. But remember, one thing above all, this is all speculation because I don't think any of us know the exact answer. And I'm sure there will come a point where we do find out some of the answers. I don't think we'll ever find out all of them. But it's a very fascinating situation. And again, the fact is, we are gonna see Cody Rhodes in in WWE. It seems like 99.9% chance that is happening. And as for what led to it, I think we know how this works in the podcast space, right? Like these interviews are going to happen, and details are going to be discussed, and how many of those details come out, perhaps we'll see. I don't think all of them will, like I mentioned, but I think there will be, from Cody's perspective, once either he appears in WWE. If he starts doing some of the interview stuff, I'm not sure. But we will learn more about this and maybe what led to this decision. And, we'll see with it. But for now, this is what we know. And, again, to me, it's all leading to Cody returning to WWE and how he makes his debut there. We talked about it on last week's podcast. How will Vince McMahon use him? I think he'll use him very strong, at least initially, because of the MJFs and the Wardlows and the guys whose contracts are going to be expiring in AEW. And you want to at least send a message that, hey, we're not the big bad wolf. We can use people the right way if we want to use them the right way. And whether that has any impact on MJF or Wardlow in the future, guys like that want to jump from AEW to WWE, we'll see. But it's a very, very interesting time, both I think for WWE and for AEW, which we talk about WrestleMania. But before we get to WrestleMania, we will have AEW Revolution, which will take place here, not too far away now from Revolution. And I think that, we're, basically 2 weeks away at this point, I guess. That's a card that's also shaping up in a very interesting way, and we'll see kind of what you get from that. Of course, you're going to have Hangman Page versus Adam Cole for the AEW title. It's going to be Thunder Rosa, Britt Baker. We know as well. That's another one that's going to be very exciting. Punk and MJF in the dog collar match. It's going to be the three-way tag team match for the AEW World Tag Team titles. We don't know the opponents yet. You're listening to this on Wednesday. You will start to get a clearer picture of that on Dynamite and moving forward after that. And then, of course, the Face of the Revolution ladder match, which already involves three houses. Powerhouse, one of them indeed. Powerhouse Hobbs, Keith Lee, and Wardlow. So the big man ladder match is taking shape here. We'll see who else gets added to the mix there. But there's some thoughts on hot topics in the world of wrestling right now. There's a lot of them. It's just, I think this is one of the most interesting times we've had in wrestling in quite a while, just because of all the different dynamics in play. WrestleMania around the corner, the Cody Rhodes stuff, state of AEW. There's so much happening. Steve Austin, as we said, maybe The Rock too. I think we may have talked about this last week, but The Rock kind of teased recently as well on Twitter that he could be making his return soon. Will The Rock show up at WrestleMania 38, perhaps to start that build towards WrestleMania 39 with Roman Reigns, which I think is going to absolutely happen, barring any conflicts in scheduling, which you never know with The Rock. He's got a busy schedule, but we will certainly have it covered, all of these developments over at 41mania.com. Be sure to check out everything we got going on over there. Of course, our news, our columns, reviews, they're all there. So check everything out, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast. Any podcast app you use, search for 401 on Wrestling. And as always, we have a link to the GoFundMe for Larry Zonka's family in the show notes. Be sure to continue to share and contribute to that if you can. And everything else, 401mania.com. Hopefully, as I've done here now for at least a week or two, we'll be a little more consistent on our podcast here moving forward. We'll try to do these weekly, and also try to do more of the one-off sort of reviews on anything big happening, big, huge stories, breaking stories, those kind of things. We'll have some guests back on as well, and we'll look at some of these big shows we've got coming up, as we said. Revolution around the corner, then WrestleMania coming up sooner than you think. It's almost here, WrestleMania 38, so it should be a fun couple months here in the world of wrestling. So, again, everything else, 401mania.com, and thanks as always for listening to the podcast, and we'll talk to you next time here on the 411 on Wrestling Podcast.